So welcome to this survey class of Jewish history. I'm really excited to talk about really all things Jewish history, sort of counterintuitively. I'm sorry, I'm just going to disable, at least for myself, the closed captions because they're very annoying. So really, I wanted this to be more of a conversational journey through Judaism. And rather than give sort of a lengthy introduction to this course, as I usually might for other courses, I want to actually jump in and do a very short source and do a little bit of text study before even coming to introduce why we're teaching about Jewish history, what the importance of Jewish history is, and all of that. So I'm going to share my screen. For people who it's easier, I'll also drop the link to this source sheet in the chat, but I will be sharing my screen and reading everything. And I want to drop us off seemingly in the middle of the book of Deuteronomy. And I'm purposely giving very scant introduction to this. And so we hear in the middle of the book of Deuteronomy, and if you're completely lost at this point, don't worry. Hopefully we'll start out lost and find our way into some sense of, which of course encompasses Moshe's speech to the Israelites as they are about to finish their journey, right? They've already wandered for 40 years. This is now the inflection point in Jewish history where the Jewish people, the Israelites, are about to cross over the Jordan. They're about to then subsequently establish their empire, their civilization, right? This is, by some conception, the beginning of Jewish civilization. And one of the things that Moses tells, which I would guess for almost everybody here, is a familiar text. And it says, Ki yishalcha banecha machar, right? There's going to be a time tomorrow, right? Machar, sometime later on in Jewish history, that your children, right, the next generation is going to ask you, what are all these things you're doing, right? What are these decrees? What are these laws? What are these rules, right? What are all these Jewishy things that I see going on here that the Lord our God has enjoined upon you, right? A very classic text of education, right? Children who grow up in a tradition, children who grow up in a specific community are going to have some questions about what they're growing up with, right? It seems like all the other children, say in Fullerton, are celebrating Christmas. Why are we celebrating Hanukkah, right? What are these weird things that we're doing that's not necessarily the norm for our society? So it says, you shall say to your children, right? And here it becomes familiar because this is, of course, one of the answers that we get in the Passover Seder. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord wrought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and all his households. And us he had freed from there, that he might take us and give us to the land that he had promised on oath to our fathers. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these laws, to revere the Lord our God for our lasting good and for our survival, as now is the case. Okay, so again, painting the setting. Moses, this is the waning years of his life. He is talking to the Israelites right as they're about to cross over the Jordan River, right? This is sort of the apex of the beginning of Jewish civilization. What's the problem with this text, right? This is something that nearly all medieval, all contemporary Bible scholars, when they read this text, there seems to be a glaring, I don't want to say mistake, but something glaring, right? There should be a red flag that goes off the second we read this text. I'm curious if anybody reads this and sees something strange, something abnormal, right? You can feel free to shout out. You can feel free to type in the chat. But take a second, read this text again. Consider the context of the book of Deuteronomy. What is weird about this text?
Do you mean that it says enjoin unto you?
Okay,
Like,
so
what does it mean unto you, upon you instead of upon us?
Okay, so I love it, Cindy. You're picking up on exactly what the Passover Seder does, right? So this is, of course, the famous Haggadah interpretation of this is presumably, a son who's removed from the community or a child removed because they're using the sort of pronoun you, right? You and not to me. Presumably from a more baseline tradition and interpretation, right? Without us later on knowing what the Haggadah says about this, it seems like I'm almost imagining, like a 7-year-old here, right? Who's sitting and again, this isn't necessarily, by the way, just some sort of background here, right? Obviously, because we know this text in the context of the Haggadah, we're all thinking Passover Seder. That's not necessarily the case, right? Moshe is not specifically talking about just Pesach. He's actually talking about Judaism as a whole. So the way that I'm almost picturing this is, in the future, you're going to have little kids, right? You have a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, whatever age, they're going to see us doing all the Jewishy things, and they're going to then ask a question. So I like it. I like the thought process here, because it does have to do with the pronouns that are being used here. Other thoughts here?
I was thinking, can I talk, Daniel?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I was thinking it says well, as you preface the Hebrew better, I think than it says, there will come a time, right? And then at the end it says, as is now the case. Is the time now? It says it'll be in the future. So what is this, for all time? That we need to observe these laws, that it's best that we do for our own survival? Because it's almost talking about, to me, it's the present, as is now the case, but you said at the beginning, it means there will come a time in the future that you need to do this. So I'm a little confused as to why it went to the future and then went to the present tense.
Yeah, I love it. And I think that gets us a little bit closer here, because you're focusing on the tenses, right? There's something weird going on here, right? There's seemingly, and here's what I want to go with this, and hopefully this will make sense why I'm starting a class on Jewish history with this seemingly random text. There seems to be a collapsing of past, present, and future in these texts, right? Is this a text about history? Is this a text about the present? Is this a text about being forward-looking? The answer is all three, right? Obviously, this text was written in a specific time, talking about a specific historic event. By the way, one of the things that scholars note, sort of what I was getting at with my original question, was the sort of strangest thing about this is the definition, by definition, the nation that Moses is speaking to in the book of Deuteronomy is not the people who left Egypt. It's the generation after, right? That generation had all died out, right? They were forced to wander the wilderness for 40 years to die out. And all of a sudden, Moses is saying, what are you going to say when your children ask you what you're doing? You say, we were slaves in Egypt, not my parents were slaves in Egypt, not my aunt and uncle were slaves in Egypt, right? And the commentators, understandably, are confused, right? They use this as a jumping off point. And Ethan, I'll take your question or comment in 1 second, right? They use this as a jumping off point, and you can understand why then Jewish sources go on, and the Haggadah says, and the Midrash says, and other Jewish sources say, in our tradition, it's not enough to remember history. It's not enough to talk about history, right? B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lerot et atzmo, right? In every generation, you actually have to view yourself as if you're reliving Jewish history. And so even to start off by talking about history, right? And there's a YouTube link here to a funny speech. I won't exactly, I'm not going to share it and play the video now, but it's Avraham Infield, who became the head of a whole variety of Jewish organizations. And he tells a really funny story that I'll try to tell here, but you can, if anyone's curious, they can find the link and click on it. Is that when he was in undergrad, he decided to change his major to Jewish history. And he was a little bit nervous, telling his parents. Generally, when you tell your parents you want to study Jewish history, it's not exactly, the highest hopes that maybe your average Jewish parent might have for their children, right? And so you're studying Jewish history, and he calls his dad, and his dad says, what do you mean Jewish history? And he says, Jewish history. And his dad very comedically says, Jews don't have history. We have memory, right? And this becomes almost a famous line, that from some conception, there is no such thing from a Jewish traditional point of view of Jewish history, right? What do we mean when we talk about history? Are we talking about the actual facts and archaeology and literary documents that are in the Jewish past? Or are we talking about the collective memory of our people that subsequently leads to the traditions we're doing today to then get us forward looking to tomorrow? We'll do a little bit more on this in a second. Ethan, did you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I was going to comment also like how you were saying a second ago, how the timeline may be a bit confusing because he's talking to this future generation. But if it is this future generation, wouldn't Moses also potentially have passed away by then?
So
By the
Moses did, right? This is his last speech before he then
Oh, okay.
goes on to die before crossing over.
Okay.
So he was sort of the last of that generation. Okay, so for this sort of first class, which is going to both serve as an introductory class, and also we're going to have to start today because I think we're attempting to do this in 10 weeks, and we're attempting to cover roughly 4,000 years in 10 weeks. So we can see how easy it is to do about 400 or 500 years a week here, right? It goes without saying that means we're probably going to have to skip over important dates, important facts. And so one of the things that Rabbi Tilshon and I agreed on is we're going to try to send supplementary material. So we're going to roughly try to follow the format from NJOP, who has this whole course that they designed. I've never really been good at following preordained courses or rules in general. So a lot of this is sort of material that I've put together, but every class we're going to send supplementary material of here's what else happened in those couple 100-year link. But really the goal of this course by the end of it is for us to have a bird's eye picture view of the Jewish story, the Jewish narrative, Jewish history, Jewish memory, however we want to conceptualize it in our head. And so for today, a couple of foundational questions that I want to get at, and these should be questions that just methodologically, right, when talking especially about Jewish history and memory, should always be in the back of our mind, and hopefully we'll come back to these at the end of today's class, and hopefully they'll make a little bit more sense for people who are still sitting here very confused, thinking that I was going to pull out a timeline and start reading in 1800 BCE, this starts, and 1700 BCE, that starts, right? So the foundational question one, how do we evaluate Jewish history as opposed to Jewish memory? So what do I mean by that question, right? It sounds very academic-y and jargony. What would happen today, right? And I think that this is an important question for especially Jews in the modern world to think about. If you took a time machine back 3,400 years ago to the date that presumably the Israelites left Egypt, and you just saw no one there, right? From a historical perspective, right? If you were an academic historian attending a university, right? That would be fodder for incredible research, right? You would write your new book. The Exodus never happened, right? The story is some sort of made up myth, right? Maybe representative of something else that happened, right? But from a Jewish memory perspective, right? Imagine running into the synagogue on Passover morning, or almost playing the role of Eliyahu Hanavi and visiting different people's Pesach Seders and telling them, hey guys, I just got back from the past. There was no story. What I would think would happen was everybody would look at them and say, please don't bother us with history. We're discussing the Exodus from Egypt, right? And that should strike us as a little bit strange, right? And part of what Jewish memory does from some conception is, yeah, we're worried about the past, but actually when Jews study the past, and I'm going to put the past in quotation marks, we're almost never talking about history. We're talking about how we view ourselves in the world and what things we want to subsequently do tomorrow, right? Passover just ends up being the paradigmatic example of this, because Passover is ubiquitous within our tradition, right? We talk about this all the time whenever we talk about the Exodus from Egypt. Right? We talk about the Exodus from Egypt in Shema. We talk about the Exodus from Egypt in the Shabbat Kiddush. We talk about it, of course, during the Passover Seder, right? The rabbis in the Talmud will tell us there's actually a positive mitzvah to every single day remember the Exodus from Egypt, right? So no matter who you are, if you're Jewish doing anything remotely traditionally Jewish, you cannot escape the Exodus. What does our tradition say the primary importance of remembering the Exodus is? Well, it's so that in the present and in the future, we embody the ethics and morals of the Exodus. So on a moral level, the Tanakh tells us over and over again, you were strangers in Egypt, therefore today, you shall not wrong the stranger, the person who has less than you. On a forward-looking level, it should say, there's going to be a time when the next generation is going to be coming of age, asking foundational questions about who they are, and here's what you should tell them, right? There's no discussion of archaeological artifacts in the Passover Seder. There's no discussion of the exact dates, the exact time in history. The Passover Seder actually in some way is a story of people discussing the story, right? It's almost that level of meta, right? Without going too far down this rabbit hole, right? What do we read in the Passover Seder? Well, we read about obviously the first Exodus, then we read about 40 years later. We read then about how the Jews are supposed to commemorate the Exodus when they bring the first fruits into the temple. We then read about stories of rabbis under the Roman rule, how they celebrated Pesach. We then read about medieval stories about Passover, right? So I want to actually differentiate, right, just in this sort of initial question, that already we have to make a differentiation between two ideas, right, that hopefully we'll be coming back to throughout not just this first class, but really the entire class as a whole. And I'll just introduce this and then we'll take some time for questions, and then we'll actually get into some hard ideas and facts, quote unquote. So history is being defined as the whole series of past events connected with something or someone, right? Whereas memory or collective memory is the memory of a group of people passed down from one generation to the next. And it turns out that actually what shapes who we are, not just as a collective, right? We can forget Judaism for a second. Who we are as individuals, right? There's been a ton of psychological research in the past 30, 40 years about this. Who we are today depends on our memory, whether or not that's true or not, right? They've done a whole series of studies. People who are more optimistic are generally people whose memory of their life so far is from a more optimistic perspective, regardless of whether or not they've actually were happy moment to moment, right? This is the work of scholars such as Elizabeth Loftus at UCI, right? Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, right? All the various fields of behavioral economics, sociology, psychology are sort of converging on this idea that what actually happened in the past, whether we're talking about ancient history of 4,000 years ago, or even what you were like when you were 12 years old, is actually far less important than how you remember it. And it turns out that this becomes a foundational idea when talking about Judaism and Jewish history. And so, yes, during this class, we're going to talk about sort of the facts of Jewish history. And I'll be very careful, for people whose goal is to come out of this 10-week course with a factual timeline of Jewish history, you'll get that. But I think actually more importantly, right, from Temple Beth Tikva's point of view, from the Jewish Collaborative point of view, right, the reason why we're here studying Jewish history is not, I have a hunch, because we're all fascinated about exactly what happened in 1800 BCE at the dawn of the Iron Age, right? If we were, there are plenty of, dense scholarly books that we can read about it, right? I have a hunch that the reason why most people are interested in a class on the Jewish past and Jewish history is actually to inform what they're going to do today and what they're going to do tomorrow and how they then want to lead their life and shape community today. So one quick text just on this, and then we'll pause for some questions, and then we'll actually get into sort of the dawn of Jewish history. So one book that I just want to flag, because I think it's been one of the most impressive, interesting Jewish historical scholarly works, is this book called Zahor. For people who are actually in the link, here's a link to the Amazon order in case you're curious. It's very dense, but it's really interesting. And Zahor, again, quite literally means memory or remembering. And so here is a quote that I want to throw out there, and then I'm actually going to unshare my screen so we can have a little bit of a conversation on it before we move on. So he says, that is the central argument, and we're about to introduce what that is, but the central argument of Yerushalmi's 1982 book, Zahor, one of the most influential works on Jewish history in the last half a century. Zahor is the Hebrew word for remember, a command delivered many times in the Bible. And it is possible to see Judaism itself as a technology of memory, a set of practices designed to make the past present. Read the Bible closely, and you will find that the holiday of Passover, which commemorates the Jews' exodus from Egypt, is established by Moses before the exodus actually takes place. It is as though the miracle happens primarily so that it can be remembered. What does he mean by this? Well, if you actually want to fact check this, right, if you look up the 12th chapter of the book of Exodus, you have this final climactic scene of the Exodus where Moses is again telling the Israelites, okay, we're about to go. And right as they're about to go, before they actually go, Moses gathers them and says, your children are one day going to ask you about this. Here's what you better make sure you have ready to tell them. And this actually happens before the event. right? And so from sort of a meta analysis of what are we actually trying to accomplish in Jewish tradition, it is almost glaringly obvious from the outset of our tradition that our narratives, our foundational stories, are much more about how they affect us today than they are about what actually factually happened thousands of years ago. Okay, pausing for 1 second for any thoughts or questions. What are we at so far? What is our lost to understanding ratio here? And I see that there's a couple of comments in the chat. Yeah, Ethan, go for it. And I'll read the chat questions while we go.
Just thinking, it's really interesting to think of Jewish history through memory. Not to get too like philosophical, but like John Locke, who's a British empiricist philosopher, like when he talked about like identity and like human identity, he would say like, oh, your identity only goes back as far as you can link a memory to it. So like as far as you can remember back, you're the same person. But once you stop remembering or you don't remember something, then it's no longer the same identity. And so just this idea that like in order for Judaism to exist, you have to remember the past of it and keep in mind what's already happened. I thought it was a cool connection.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that'll come across more and more in this class, because from some perspective, it's almost an interesting thought experiment, right? We can go back in time 2,800 years, let's say, to the first temple, the first Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem, right? This is factual, right? All scholars, note that there was a first temple in Jerusalem, and we can sort of observe the way that Judaism might have been practiced back in the year 2,800 BCE, right? Animal sacrifices were ubiquitous, right? There was a priesthood, right? Instead of showing up to synagogue Shabbat morning for, a nice service with other people and maybe a Torah study, you're lining up outside the temple to hear the Levites play music and the Kohanim, the priests, doing very specific rituals with how they splash the blood on different walls of the altar. And you might ask yourself, what is our connection to these people, right? If we were to go back in time 2,800 years, we would be completely lost. I mean, it's not just the way lost as if we, maybe stepped into, a different denominational synagogue or even a different religion. We would have nothing in common with this group of people, right? But the thing that connects us to them, again, is a shared memory, right? There's a shared basis from which we can begin to almost have a conversation with people in the past. Because one of the things that would have been consistent between that community and our community is not our views on social issues, not our views on how to worship God, not our views on God, right? I can almost guarantee you that. What would be similar? Well, this week is Parsha Lech Lecha, right? It's a third Torah portion in the Torah. We're actually going to talk about Abraham in a second, so it's top of mind. They would also be talking about Abraham this week, right? Maybe their views on Abraham would be very different, right? Maybe they would disagree with us about how to analyze the character of Abraham, but they would be talking about the same shared memory that we're talking about. And that's something that I don't think can be taken away, right? No matter how big the schisms in the contemporary Jewish community grow, no matter how different factions of the Jewish community are, no matter how different we might be than Jews 2,800, 2,000, even 800 years ago are, right? We do have that shared collective memory. Ruth, I see your hand.
I thought your remark about being 12 years old was interesting, because how many times do we say to our parents, remember when that such and such happened? And they look at you like, what? What are you talking about? And yet, I can't remember. I remember my phone number, and I remember the street name and those kinds of facts. But if I think about my childhood and my upbringing and my young life, I think really more in memories. And when you get a group of people who will share those memories, that becomes more important than history, than facts.
Sorry, I don't know what will that be. Yeah.
Marilyn, go for it.
Okay, I don't know if I could say this very eloquently, but as you were talking, what occurred to me is that the blurring of the lines between factual history and memory, it seemed to be a way to accept the Torah as our history, whether or not we can prove, whether or not we're successful in proving that it actually happened. Because as you said, it is so endemic to Judaism and to every Jew. So I don't, I hope I'm getting across what I'm trying to say. It,
100%.
it sort of makes it, more okay to study the Torah as history.
Yeah, 100%. One of my favorite rabbinic stories, I wasn't planning on whipping this out, but I think, hopefully it'll eventually help us get led to the dawn of Jewish history where we're supposed to start today, is the rabbis tell a story in the Midrash, right? So this is sort of the early Talmudic period, think 3rd, 4th, 5th century CE. And this is at a time of major Jewish innovation, right? If we know one thing about the Talmud was the document that allowed Judaism to evolve from this temple-centric animal sacrifice tradition that can only be practiced one area in the world, right, a mountain in Jerusalem, to the fact that today in Orange County, I'm able to live a fully rich Jewish life, right? That was the Talmud, right? So the rabbis were innovators, right? They were inventors, they were interpreters. So the rabbis tell a story, and the rabbis say, when Moses was on top of Mount Sinai, he saw God drawing calligraphy crowns onto the top of letters. Now, anybody who's ever looked into a Torah scroll would know that the letters are not just letters. You have letters, and then there's little crowns on some of the letters, right? Some nice calligraphy, probably, just a nice artistic way of showing that this is an important book. And so the rabbis say, well, when Moses was on Sinai, he sees God drawing those crowns onto the letters. And now Moses, as curious man he probably was, asks God, why are you drawing these crowns on the letters, right? Isn't it enough that you're giving us this guidebook, you're giving us the Torah? Why do we need this sort of surrounding art? And God says, Moses, you might not be able to understand it, but actually sometime in the future, there's going to be a great man named Rabbi Akiva, and he's actually going to be able to pull out Jewish laws from each and every crown. So Moses, of course, responds and says, I want to see, right? Go ahead and show me. So Moses time travels into the future. He's sitting in the back of Rabbi Akiva's classroom, and he has no idea what's going on, right? I always joke, his preparation before class, right? Moses is completely lost in the back of Rabbi Akiva's classroom, and Moses is understandably becoming a little depressed, right? How could it be that the man who hand-delivered the Torah, that actually dictated it verbatim, has zero clue what's going on in a classroom conversation about Torah? And so at one point, after Moses is sitting in the back for some time, a student raises their hand and says, Rabbi Akiva, how do we know what you're teaching us, right? It seems like you're sort of pulling this out from nothing. And Rabbi Akiva says, no. Everything I'm teaching you now is halacha Moshe Missinai, right? It's the oral law that God gave Moses at Sinai. Now, again, understand, Moses is sitting in the back of this classroom and he has zero clue what's going on. And so you might think that if you're Moses at this point, you raise your hand and say, sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about. What do you mean this is the oral tradition given to me at Sinai? But instead, the story goes, Moses said his heart became full and he was happy and he sat and enjoyed the rest of the lecture. Now, this is an incredible story because what this story attests to is exactly, Ethan, I think what you just said, and hopefully this will lead us right into the beginning of the actual dawn of Jewish history. One, there's a collapsing of past, present, and future. So again, they're not concerned, right? Jewish tradition, the rabbis of the Talmud as the chief architectures of Jewish tradition are not concerned with, wait, did Moses literally time travel? Would he actually have known what's going on, right? One, they're not interested in that. But I think even more profoundly, the way that a tradition, a civilization, a people, any entity is able to survive, not just for a couple hundred years, but a couple thousand years, right? Moving across the world, moving across times, dealing with tragedy, dealing with new challenges, is specifically the ability to take the past, to reanalyze it, reread it, reinterpret, and have that move us into the future without losing that connection to the past, right? It's a really tough juggling match, right? And this is something that Jewish tradition has done over and over again. Bob asked me before what the class I teach at UCI is, and the way that I actually design my course, right? The course I teach at UCI is an Intro to Judaism class. And when they asked me to teach this Intro to Judaism class, I immediately changed the name to Major Jewish Texts and made the class all about literature. Because one of the things that I want to teach the students is you can actually understand the evolution and survival of Judaism through what Jews were actually talking about and how they were interpreting older texts, right? And it's a really interesting way to view a tradition where we're so steeped in memory, we're so steeped in the past, but we're never stuck in the past, right? As I know Rabbi Nico used to say a lot, right? Judaism is not supposed to be a museum, right? A museum is what happens when you go to look at something. Oh, isn't that nice? And it's preserved behind glass, and hopefully it'll remain there for all of eternity, right? Judaism is the opposite of a museum, right? Judaism has to be something that's living in the real world, which then by definition makes it malleable, right? We don't want to, from some perspective of history and memory, and then this will be the last thing I say on this because I feel like we can talk about this for the next hour. We don't want Judaism to some extent to remain a sort of flat history where everything we do remains the same. Oh, I got this from my parents, they got it from their parents, all the way back to Moses, right? That wouldn't be a alive, robust tradition. That would be one time in history, thousands of years ago, a bunch of our forefathers created a museum and created some foundational texts. And every once in a while, we go visit that museum and say, oh, isn't that nice? Right? The very fact that Judaism is a robust, alive tradition means that things are changing, which actually means that our memory of the Jewish past has to be changing. Ethan, let me take your question in a little bit, just because I want to make sure to actually get into some history here. Otherwise, we'll have to change the name of this class. Okay, so we'll start off at sort of the dawn of Jewish memory, which is Abraham, which coincidentally, as I said before, it works out nicely because this week's Torah portion is the portion where we're really introduced to Abraham, right? He's introduced at the end of Genesis 11, but it's really Genesis 12 that Abraham is first called upon. So I want to share my screen. And Fred, can I ask you to do some reading, to read Genesis 12 here?
There you go.
Now the Lord said to Abram, go to your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Fred. So what we have until now, right? And, again, because we're trying to cover many hundred years every class, there's going to have to be some, in the meantime, summaries. So everything we have before this, for those who haven't been paying attention for the last two parshiot in Shul, the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis are what a lot of scholars say as almost prehistory, right? These are sort of the mythical stories at the beginning of time, right? What a lot of scholars might call etiological tales, meaning stories to tell why things are the way they are, right? So we discussed Adam and Eve, right? We had the first murder with Cain and Abel, right? We have the global flood with Noah. We then have a lot of very short stories of, and then this person begot this person, and this person came up with agriculture, and this person came up with weapons, and this person came up with this, right? Tales to tell why the world is the way they are, right? The Tower of Babel being a story for why there's so many different cultures and languages in the world. And all of a sudden, right, if we think of the first 11 chapters, there's sort of a narrowing, right? A consistent narrowing that happens until we're left with one person, right? God initially wants everything to be perfect, right? That doesn't work out round one, right? Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden. They have to live in the real world. It turns out the real world is full of chaos, what the Torah calls Hamas, right? In the beginning of the portion of Noah, right? The world is so terrible, God has to set the reset button. And just over and over again, the world, from whatever reason, is not able to get its act together, right? Lo and behold, when you look around the world, things are not perfect for some reason. And so the way that the biblical narrative goes is, again, a narrowing until we're left with one person, right? Almost as if, and this is what a lot of Jewish thinkers, especially the Kabbalists, will write about Abraham, is they say at a certain point, humanity forgot what it was like to have a relationship with God, right? In the Garden of Eden, everything presumably was perfect. And after a certain point, if you imagine God speaking out to humanity as a certain radio frequency, everybody's radio was off except for one person's, right? That one person happened to be Abraham. So it's not, right, again, from some sort of Jewish philosophic view, it's not that God directly came to one person, right? This is important, by the way, because one of the most controversial notions, I think, in Jewish tradition is the idea of Jewish chosenness, right? Directly connected to this passage here. And actually, when we try to understand what the idea of chosenness means from a Jewish traditional perspective, whatever we might think about notions of chosenness today, right? Let's put that off to the side. When Jews say chosenness, are we saying that God is the one who chose the Jews? Or are we saying the opposite? Are we saying that the Jewish nation, starting with Abraham, are the ones who chose God, right? Those are very different ways, right? One is saying we are superior because of some top-down mechanism of God says we're better. I want to argue that's almost never been an internally Jewish definition of what chosenness is. Oftentimes it's been an outside for people who want to criticize the Jewish community. They say, oh, they believe X, Y, and Z. But one of the things that I actually want to talk about with Abraham, right? Because how we see Abraham is how we see the dawn of our tradition. And one more thing before we start getting into some other texts about Abraham, and this is now connecting back to our history conversation. Did Abraham ever exist as an individual? Truth is, I have no idea. No scholars have any idea, right? It's not like we've ever found a diary from the land of Ur or the land of Canaan from 3,800 years ago saying, this is the diary of Abraham, right? Day one, I have traveled out from my dad Terach's house and, I'm in a desert, right? Such a thing obviously doesn't exist. If it ever did exist, there's no chance we'd be able to find it, right? But what does Abraham represent? And this is an old Jewish idea, right? Jewish traditions almost never necessarily related to Abraham, to Sarah, to Isaac, to Jacob, to our forefathers and foremothers. Jewish traditions almost never related to these individuals as individuals. What have we related to them as? To wider metaphors about the Jewish nation at the inception of our history, right? This is an idea that's quoted in the Midrash, right? The rabbinic literature of the 3rd to 5th century. This is quoted by the Jewish thinker, the medieval Spanish Jewish thinker, Nachmanides, right? They say, what's the point of all these stories about Abraham, about Isaac and Jacob, right? From some conception of the Torah, why do I need this, right? Just tell me the rules. Tell me what I need to do next Shabbat. Tell me how to celebrate Passover. Tell me what I can eat. Why do I need all these tales about all of these ancient figures? So what Nachmanides says, right, he develops this into a much longer essay. He says, Maaseh Avot Simon Labanim, right? 4 very simple words, right? The story of our forefathers is a sign, a symbol, right? You could also interpret it metaphor for the descendants. What does he mean by that? When our tradition talks about Abraham as an individual that started to forge a new path at the dawn of time, right? An Abraham that from the very beginning was called upon to do something different, to start a different chapter of history. We're not necessarily talking about one person named Abraham. We're talking about an entire nation in the ancient world, right? Our ancestors, our descendants that did exactly this. How do we know they did this? Because we're still talking about it today, right? There was some change that happened, right? Again, if you're more religiously inclined, you say this is some interaction with the divine. If you're less religiously inclined, this was some of the greatest philosophers in the ancient Middle East coming together. But somehow, and we'll discuss this in a second, there was an inflection point here at the dawn of the Iron Age, right? Again, Abraham is usually placed, right? I have a timeline because, again, we do have to go to a little bit of history here, right? Sometime between 2000 and 1800 BCE, right? This is 4,000 to 3,800 years ago, right? There was obviously some moment at the dawn of time when our ancestors decided enough with the human sacrificial idolatry that's happening in the ancient world, right? We see what's happening in the land of Canaan, where people are offering their children to gods, right? You can still go today, by the way, If you go right outside the walls of Jerusalem, right, it's called the Valley of Genom. Yes, the word Gehenna comes from this valley. I think today in Jerusalem, it's a place that has a lot of food trucks and there's some music. It's actually quite pleasant to go to, right, on a nice summer night, right? Archaeologists have dug there, and what they found was hundreds upon hundreds of the bones of children, right, presumably from ancient Canaanite gods, such as Molech, who, if you read ancient Canaanite and Akkadian ideas and religion, demanded human sacrifice, right? Judaism came upon, right, our ancestors came up and said, no more, we are not doing this, right? We can compare the inception of Jewish history to ancient Egypt, right? Another great empire in the world at exactly this time. What do we know about ancient Egypt, both from the Torah and of course from primary firsthand accounts that we found that Egyptologists have found in their discovery? How was Egypt built? It was built by slaves, right? Were those slaves, right? Did Jews build the pyramid? Again, that's a historic question, right? But Egypt certainly did have slaves, right? This is a society that certainly did view humans in a caste system. What did our ancestors say? At the same time that Egypt, one of the greatest empires in the ancient world, was employing slaves, at the same time when the Canaanites were offering their children, Israelite thinkers were saying all humans were created in the image of God, right? So again, this is history, right? How did that play out? We have no idea. We weren't there, right? The archaeological, the literary, the historical evidence is scamped. I mean, what would we expect to find from individuals, maybe a couple dozen, a couple hundred, even a couple thousand, 4,000 years ago in a desert? But these ideas, the ideas at the foundation of our tradition, the ideas that are preserved in these foundational narratives in the Torah, this of course is history, not just because we have writings about it, but because these ideas survive till today. Still, some of the most foundational ideas that we govern our society with today are ideas that we're been coming up with at this inception of Jewish history. So again, a couple sources of Abraham, just so we can sort of get a sense of the Jewish traditional notion of this ancient history. Ruth, can I ask you to read the Midrash about Abraham?
Abraham would roam in his mind thinking, how long shall we bow down to the work of our hands? It is not right to worship and bow down to anything but the earth, which brings forth fruit and sustains us. But when he saw that the earth needs rain, and that without the sky opening and sending down rain, the earth would grow nothing at all, he thought again, it is not right to bow down to anything but the sky. He looked again and saw the sun, which gives light to the world and brings forth the plants, and thought, not right to bow down to anything but the sun. But when he saw the sun setting, he thought, that is no God. He looked again at the moon and stars that give light at night, and thought, to these it is right to bow down. But when the dawn broke, they were all effaced, and he thought, these are no gods. He was in distress at the thought, if these phenomena have no mover, why does one set and the other rise? When Abraham saw the appearance and disappearance of phenomena in nature, he thought, unless there were someone else in charge, this would not happen. It is not right to bow down to these, but to the one in charge.
Thank you so much, Ruth. There are a lot of different variations of this Midrash for people that have probably heard this before, but heard slightly different versions, right? This ends up being, for people who are very interested in the reception history of this idea, right? It actually originates in the Book of Jubilees, which was a Second Temple literature, but then of course gets repeated over and over again in the rabbis and the Talmud and Midrash. The rabbis here, again, just to go back to our wider methodology, and I'm actually curious, if people want to shout out what they think or write in the chat. Is this a historic text or is this a memory text? And what's the difference, right? I'm curious to sort of see answers filtering in, but the answer I think has to be both, right? Of course, I don't think the rabbis are thinking this is literally what Abraham is doing. But again, they are describing a phenomena that must have happened in the ancient world. Again, Judaism came up with, discovered, whatever verb we want to use, this idea of ethical monotheism, right? It's not as if ideas, right, Judaism certainly, and I certainly do not believe in a history that's predetermined. Right? History can play out at any moment in an infinite number of ways. Nothing that's ever happened in the past and nothing that will happen is guaranteed, right? It's why Judaism has a very strong focus on our actions today, because we do acknowledge that if we do wrong things today, our society could collapse. And if we do right things over and over again, we could create a perfect world, right? This is sort of a baseline Jewish idea, right? That actions do matter and that history is not guaranteed and the future is not guaranteed. So over here, again, the idea of ethical monotheism didn't have to be discovered in history, right? It's not as if it was obvious that at some point in history, there would be a community of people that were going around in a world in which it was profitable, in which all psychological and sociological biases that were grown to be ingrained with would come up with this idea that, actually all people are created in the image of God, and there's one God, and therefore it's not that you have idol one and those other people down the street who you hate have a different idol. And if you're stronger than the other nation next door, well, you can do whatever you want to them because they're ruled by different idols and gods that are not as strong as our gods. By definition, if we took them over, right, their gods are obviously much worse, right? That was sort of the meta narrative of history that existed in time. So again, when we're talking about these foundational sources, right, it's a really complicated question of what's history and what's memory here, because no historian would teach this as literal history. But on the other hand, something like this, right, the metaphor of this must have happened at some point in history, right? I think this idea comes a little bit more ingrained, and then we'll we talk about Abraham a little bit, right? The rabbis note that over and over again in the Torah, Abraham is not called Abraham the Israelite, right? He's not called Abraham the Jew, right? He's called Abraham ha-Ivri, right? Ivri, roughly translating to Hebrew, right? If you want to say Hebrew in Hebrew, it's Ivrit, right? And the rabbis are noting, right? Why was Abraham called Abraham ha-Ivri, right? Where does the word Hebrew come from? Well, the entire world would be on one side of a scale, right? Other rabbinic accounts say of a river, right? And a little bit of Hebrew etymology is important for this. The word for the other side in Hebrew is Aver, and Abraham would stand on the other, right? So who are the Hebrews? Who are our ancestors? We're people who were different. We're people who, when the entire society was on one side of the scale, when the entire society had one set of belief system, when the entire world was doing one set of things, when they had one such view of people, our ancestors, whether it was Abraham the individual or a collection of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in ancient Israel, were people who dared to challenge the status quo, right? We were people, Aver, right, on the other side, right? It didn't matter that all of society, that even everyone in the ancient world was like Terach, the idol worshiper. Abraham was willing to be different. I'm going to pause here, unshare screen. I would love to hear some thoughts sort of in this. Again, I'm throwing a lot of ideas here and trying to blend history and memory in a way, again, talking about the inception of Judaism and ancient Jewish history does require some sort of a intersection between history and memory here, but I would love to hear some thoughts. Yeah, go for it, Henry.
So I have to say that this is an engineer trying to be a philosophy major. So, but it seems to me that that rabbinical passage was people trying to make some rational sense out of the sun and the moon, and saying if it just seems like if this then that, if the sun disappears and the moon disappears, well, how can they be gods? There is something that is superior to them, and therefore we believe in a one God. It's just a way of rationalizing it, and I think probably that's been done by a lot of civilizations.
Yeah, I like the point. And that's why, again, is this a philosophic text or is this a historical text? And I'm not sure, meaning I'm sure at some point in Jewish history, this was a compelling argument, right? Obviously in the, if anybody's ever pained themselves to watch those, multi-hour debates between, theists and atheists, one that are, everywhere on the internet, right? Like you have some version of this debate going back and forth, and everybody leaves already concluding what they came into the conversation thinking, right? So I'm not sure if this argument has ever convinced anybody in history that hasn't already agreed with it. I think the rabbis, you might be right that the rabbis are talking philosophy, but they're also in some sense talking history, right? They are, again, the rabbis are now 2,000 years after Abraham presumably existed, right? So we've already moved on a long time, but they're still in a society, a Greco-Roman world or a Babylonian Zoroastrian world that does believe in multiple deities. And so I think they are trying to tell some sort of historic narrative of why are we so different, right? Like why do all other nations have X, Y, and Z belief system? And how is it that our ancestors came up with ideas that not only changed our community, but then changed the world? Susan, was that a hand or was that a frustrated moving to one side?
It wasn't really a hand, but I'm sitting here thinking how once again, I am so amazed at the construction of Torah, or the first 5 books in particular, how in my eyes, it really does go from, I want to say primitive, but I usually say childish view of the world. And it's step by step, it appears to me to step by step bring us into adulthood. And so those initial stories of trying to understand why things existed, Garden of Eden, their sons, Noah, all that. And now we're coming to, okay, this is giving us an explanation of the things we couldn't explain before, that the sun does set and that the moon isn't always there. And so that's like a more mature step. And Torah to me just keeps making us more and more grown up, and does offer philosophy, but like throughout life, kind of.
Yeah, one of the most interesting readings of the Tanakh that I've ever come across, there's a famous Bible scholar named Richard Elliott Friedman. He's most famous for his book, Who Wrote the Bible? But he wrote another book that was called The Disappearing God of the Hebrew Bible. And his argument is that, right, again, we can take or leave his argument, right? It's not the purpose of the next half hour, but his argument is that if you actually read the Hebrew Bible as one piece of literature, right, from the Garden of Eden to the Persian exile, the Babylonian exile and Persian return to Israel, it reads as a story of God having to quite literally hold the hands of humanity, all the way to stories like the Purim story, where famously God doesn't actually make an appearance, and God being something that's behind the scenes, a sort of a moral force, that's a forward-looking force. And he basically says almost exactly what you said, that actually you can read the Hebrew Bible as a view of God, right? As sort of a philosophy that goes from most childish of, okay, what do you mean that there was a God who was walking hand by hand with Adam and Eve in a garden? Okay, right? Are we picturing, a proverbial old man that's, walking with young Adam and Eve, all the way to, sort of a much more mature adult, right? Whatever we want to call God towards the end of the Hebrew Bible, where you get books like the book of Job and the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, and the book of Esther, where people realize that actually, no, right? We're not sitting around now, right? What's the big switch between the book of Exodus and the book of Esther? It's in the book of in the book of Exodus, it's God doing the taking out and the saving. And the book of Esther reads almost like a political book, right? This is at a time, right? Still in the Tanakh, right? Still in our Holy Scripture, right? This is now humans realizing, Mordecai saying to Esther, if you don't do something, we're stuck, right? We have to act. And so again, right, there is sort of that development. Ruth, go for it.
I kind of think it's the evolution of the human mind. You know, at first accepting that which you don't understand, but just blind acceptance because it's easy. And then perhaps a thought comes and you say, well, wait a minute, why did that happen? And then, so over the course of time, I mean, not with, you know, following Abram as a metaphor here, you know, is also searching and questioning that which exists until finally coming up with a very sophisticated idea of a mover and a shaker making these things happen, rather than having them happen to you. There's a, you know, observing them, just wondering why they happen. Here you think about somebody behind the scenes, not pulling the strings, but causing things to happen. To me, it's like an evolution of a human character. I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And again, dipping back into the academic part for a second, I mean, there is, right, one of the interesting things that we get is, in some sense, right, if you actually, you know, a lot of scholarship on early Israelite depiction of God is actually very similar to how the Canaanites conceived of Baal, right? Very, very early texts, right? Again, this is sort of going down an academic rabbit hole, but one of the things that scholars note is throughout the Torah, and especially the prophets, they come and admonish the people for believing in the type of God that would act as Baal used to act, right? Like if we read the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Yechezkel, right? The sort of early prophets, right? Amos, right? These prophets, if we read them from a historical perspective, these prophets are, you know, from the 6th, 7th, and 8th century BCE. And these prophets over and over again are basically saying, you guys are doing X, Y, and Z things to worship God. God doesn't want that. You are worshiping the wrong God, right? Your conception of God is left over from some sort of earlier, archaic, immature, whatever word we want to use, right? You're not worshiping the God of the world, right? You're worshiping the God of, you know, insert thing here. And so I think that's right? I think over and over again, right? There's again, right? This is, you know, one of the most famous ideas of Maimonides, right? The 12th century Jewish thinker, is that things do, you know, history very often, especially with ideas, work a lot better when you have evolution as opposed to revolution, right? Obviously, there have been revolutions throughout history, but even revolutions, right? The ideas that aided and fomented the revolution usually develop through slow evolution, right? It's not like somebody has an idea and the next day, you know, the French Revolution happens or the American Revolution happens. And so Maimonides writes, right? He's again dealing with this question of Jewish memory and Jewish history. And he's writing, right? Again, Maimonides was one of the greatest, you know, philosophers, one of the greatest religious thinkers in history, right? He's asking this exact question, right? If God, right, this is Maimonides' question, right? So let's see his premises. If God is the force of the universe, right, is the source of all ethics and morals and ideas, right? This God is an infinite God that can't be captured in any positive descriptors. Why did God at one point in history need a house in Jerusalem and demand animal sacrifices, right? It's a very baseline philosophic question that probably even a lot of us, by the time we hop over to the book of Vayikra or Leviticus, have also, right? We're moving from these sort of incredible stories of Genesis and Exodus, and then there's sort of a collective Jewish communal moan when you get to the books of Leviticus, because a lot harder to be inspired by the first chapter of Leviticus than it is by the first chapter of Exodus or Genesis. And so what Maimonides writes was that humanity needed an evolution, right? You can't go from a society that has child sacrifice to multiple gods and multiple temples and all of a sudden expect everybody to be the greatest of medieval Greek philosophers and ethicists and, you know, have the sort of mature view of God, right? This has to happen through evolution. And so what is the Torah according to Maimonides, or the Tanakh according to Maimonides? The Torah, and this is, you know, why what he said was so radical, and actually what led to, you know, one of the things that I always say when I teach this to undergrads, because they always get very excited when I say this, one of the only times in Jewish history before the Enlightenment where you had public Jewish book burnings of other Jewish books was Maimonides' books being burned, because he writes, what is the Torah? The Torah is not the final truth on every single issue. The Torah is the beginning of a methodology or the beginning of a process that takes us from a baseline, almost animalistic mindset where might makes right, where ideas don't have power, where if I'm more powerful than you, right, all ethics go out the window, to what he says, again, in the Messianic era of a world where it's so perfect that even the lion can lay with the lamb. What does that mean? Well, even if I'm infinitely more powerful than you, I'm still going to treat you well, right? Even if I can easily tear you to pieces, right? I'm not going to do that because I'm going to have a recognition that that's wrong. And that power should not, right, or might, or economic differences, right, should not make any difference in how you treat other people, right? And so Maimonides writes, well, that takes time, right? Maybe you need to start off with animal sacrifices in a temple, and maybe eventually that evolves into something else, which evolves into something else, right? Which sets us on the path. So I love that. Any other thoughts here? And then we'll try to do one more source before we conclude this more introductory class. This will eventually, by the way, sort of PSA, this will eventually develop into sort of more actual history, because once we're past the Bible, right, history really does become a lot more solidified. And so we will be answering a lot of questions like, where does Kabbalah come from, right? Questions like, what is the actual history of the Talmud? What happened in the first and second temple? So we will be talking about those questions for, again, people that do have those gaps and really do want some more form history. But I felt like, just hopping in and talking about history when there's all these bigger looming questions here, pained me at the thought of that. So that's why we're doing a little bit of this rabbit hole today. Any other thoughts before we move on to one final source? Perfect. Okay. So towards the end of Genesis, right? And again, just filling in the gaps here, right? So we have Abraham and Sarah, right? They dare to sort of be different. They dare to travel into the land of Israel. And then, of course, they have a son, right? Or they had multiple sons, but right, for the purpose of our conversation, right? They had Isaac, right? A lot of interesting conversations, right? Such as the Akedah happened with Isaac, right? We won't get into all that now, but just one thought in the Akedah, because that's the next sort of major quote unquote Jewish chronological or historical event. At least in this reading, one of the Akedah can, there are two ways I want to propose we can read it, and then we'll get into our next source, which is about Jacob. One way is the Akedah is in some way a story of anti-child sacrifice, right? Which is almost ironic because it starts off with the premise of God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son. But what a lot of scholars will note is that this is the moment in history where Abraham realizes that what he thought was God asking him to sacrifice his son, all along, God was never asking this, right? So there's an interpretation of this story that inverts the most simplistic explanation, which is God actually did ask Abraham to sacrifice his son, right? The Midrash will actually note in the Akedah story, God never actually tells Abraham to sacrifice his son. He tells him to bring his son up, and perhaps Abraham misunderstood him. The other way to understand the Akedah is if we're forging a new path throughout history, right? If our ancestors really did have these revolutionary ideas that they wanted to foment society around, that actually does require some sort of sacrifice. Obviously not the sacrifice of literal human beings and literal children, but you actually can't have anything good in life, right? Certainly you can't have this idea to have this tradition that's going to be spread under, over multiple millennia without thinking you're going to have any sacrifice for it. And so one other idea, right? This is almost the opposite idea as before, is this sort of new tradition actually does require something from us, right? Not again, the literal sacrifice of a child, but again, some idea of having to give up something foundational, right? I like what Ruth said, right? Sacrifice your inner child or your child you once were, right? Something, right? There's some metaphor. Actually, it's interesting, Ruth, because Philo, so Philo was he was the first century Greek Jewish philosopher, right? And he was actually one of the first people in Jewish history, right? This is in the first century in sort of Greco-Roman controlled ancient Israel. And so, one of the main things that we know from history is that a lot of Jews under Greek controlled Israel were becoming increasingly Hellenized, right? This is sort of the background of the Hanukkah story, but there were obviously some Jews who were very steeped in Greek thought and also steeped in Jewish thought, right? Not surprising, right? Jews have never really lived in a historic vacuum. And so Philo reinterprets a lot of stories in the Torah with the sort of Greek philosophic lens. And when he writes about the Akedah, I wasn't gonna go here, but your comment reminded me of it, is what does Yitzchak mean in Hebrew? So Yitzchak literally means laughter, right? Even from the biblical story, right? Why is Yitzchak named Yitzchak in the Torah? Because when Sarah finds out she's gonna get pregnant, she laughs, right? So Yitzchak means laughter, right? Otherwise, more ill-defined, right? General happiness, right? And so what is the Akedah according to Philo? Well, you might think, Philo says, that to be religious requires that you sacrifice all happiness and joy in life. And when you're about to venture into something that seems like a momentous commitment, it seems like you're being asked to sacrifice your joy. But if you're actually willing to commit to that thing, you realize that no, you actually don't have to sacrifice your joy. And the thing that you thought you were going to have to sacrifice the whole time turns out to have been a mirage, right? Or a facade, right? You don't actually have to sacrifice in order to have a commitment. And so Rav Joseph Soloveitchik, right, one of the great rabbis of the 20th century, has a much longer essay where he develops this. I'd be happy to share it with anyone here. We do have one more story though. After Isaac, right, Isaac of course has his son Jacob. Jacob sort of famously or infamously has 4 wives and 13 children, right, 12 sons, 1 daughter. And Jacob, all of a sudden, something interesting happens in the biblical narrative, right? Until now, right, again, taking the Torah at face value, we're dealing with stories of individuals. And all of a sudden, something in Jacob's story now begins to take a turn. So I'm going to share my screen. Mark, can I ask you to do some reading here?
And Jacob rose up that night and took his 2 wives and his 2 handmaids and his 11 children and passed over the ford of the Jabbok. And he took them and sent them over the stream and sent over that which he had. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was strained as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for thou hast striven with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there, and Jacob called his name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And the sun rose upon him as he passed over Peniel, and he limped upon his thigh.
Thank you, Mark. Sorry for the old English there. So well, even before we get into to sort of my commentary, I'm curious, just any sort of initial thoughts. I'm going to assume that for most of us, this is not the first time seeing the story. But again, thinking through this sort of new lens of memory of history, what's happening here, right? What is the story talking about? Why do we have this sort of origin story of why, right? This is the origin story of when did we stop being Hebrews, right? The people on the other side of things. When did we start being Israel, right? Israel is the nation of Israel, right? So what are some preliminary thoughts that we have here? I can unshare my screen here so we can all see each other. Yeah, go for it. Feel free to just unmute because it's sometimes hard to see who has their hand raised.
Oh, I think the wrestling is important. I mean, we wrestle with thoughts. We wrestle with. I mean, this could be it could be a physical wrestling, but it also could be tossing and turning while you're sleeping. The idea that you have to wrestle with something, it's so physical. I thought that struck me.
Yeah, I really love that, right? And I think it goes well with the sort of context, right? This is the point of the Torah where we stop talking about individuals to some extent, right? There's still a couple, right? We have then some stories about Joseph after, right? So we're not exactly done talking about individual narratives, but this is when now there's a bunch of people instead of one, right? We talk about the tribes of Jacob, right? Jacob's sons, B'nai Yisrael, as opposed to talking about just one person, right? And this is Jacob's sons, right? They're on the move. And all of a sudden now there's a wrestling, right? It turns out that actually to be a part of this new Israelite tradition requires some sort of wrestling, right? Is it wrestling with ideas? Is it wrestling with different tensions in the world, right? It seems here that again, right, much ink has been spilled on who exactly Jacob is wrestling with. Is it himself? Is it his brother? Is it an angel? Is it a devil? Is it God, right? There's probably good arguments to make for all of these, right? But again, right after he leaves, as Mark read, he calls the place Peniel, right? Panei is face of, right? El is God, right? So right after he leaves, he sort of says, I have wrestled with God, or sorry, right after he leaves, he says, I have seen the face of God and now I'm alive, right? So there's some understanding, again, in our ancient transition from a couple of nomadic individuals that might have had some new ideas of how the world works to actually the civilization of ancient Israel, which sort of, this is where we enter into from a historic academic perspective. This is actually where historians will tell you the story starts. Because again, we can't find any artifacts about Abraham, right? I don't know what we would expect to find in the first place. If you ask a historian, what is the first hard artifact that one can find about Jewish history? What they'll say is almost always King David, right? We have inscriptions from the ancient world of King David. And what did King David do? We'll probably end up talking about this next week. But one of the radical things that King David did, right? This is according to the book of Samuel and Kings, and also according to what we know from what scholars call extra biblical evidence, right? This is stuff from the ancient world that's not in the Tanakh, is that King David took all of these different tribes that were all around the land of Israel, right? The 12 tribes, and united them under a single monarchy and deemed it the kingdom of Israel, right? That was King David's great innovation, right? He was the first king of united Israel. Yes, Saul was a king right before him, but Saul was a king over a very small land, right? King David was the first person to rule over all of united Israel, right? So this story tells a fascinating sort of wider memory behind this, right? This is the time where we evolve from individuals to a nation. I see Evelyn asked, why is an angel sent to wrestle with Jacob? Evelyn, it's a great question. I'm trying to think how to answer this on one foot without having to go into too much background. From a Torah, from the narrative of the Torah, one of the interesting things, and if we had a whole class to talk about just this episode, we can easily fill an hour and a half. Jacob spends his whole life running away, right? One of the things that we immediately note about Jacob from his youth is he sort of grows up in the shadows of his brother Esav, and he spends his whole life either running away or lying and deceiving people, right? He immediately starts out by tricking Esav, right? He ends up, getting Esav to sell the birthright to him. He tricks his father Isaac into thinking he's Esav. He then runs away from Esav. He then goes and hangs out with his uncle named Lavan. He ends up running away in the middle of the night, right? Once he marries Lavan's daughters, he runs away from Lavan. All of a sudden now he's about to reunite with his brother Esav. And this story actually comes at the heels of him about to reunite with his brother. And just going back to the story for a second, just because again, this is an incredible story. Just to reread the story in this lens of Jacob spending his whole life running away, he's on the way to reunite with his brother. And he says, and he rose up that night. He took his 2 wives, his 2 handmaids, and his 11 children and passed over the ford of the Yavok, right? It was a river. He took them and sent them over the stream, sent over that which he had. And Jacob was left alone, right? So what's happening from one such perspective? Jacob and his entire family are on their way to meet his brother Esav. Jacob sends his whole family in front of him over the river. And now it seems like he's hesitating, right? He's scared. He doesn't want to cross over, right? He doesn't want to reconnect with his brother. He wants to run away again. And actually the Midrash and other rabbinic interpretations will actually knock Jacob for this, right? They'll say this is why his punishment, right? If you think like a medieval Jewish thinker, this is why his punishment was for him to be struck on his thigh, because somebody who spends their whole life running away, right? What the rabbis call mida keneged mida, right? Sort of a measure for a measure, right? You spend your whole life running away, therefore you deserve to get, struck on your thigh. Again, we don't, no longer believe in such vindictive punishment. But again, it seems like from some perspective, right, this is when Jacob realizes he needs to stop running away. And I think going back to our sort of meta point, and then there's some other comments that we'll take here, this is when, again, it stops being about the individual, right? It stops being about Jacob as the individual, and he's almost forced to face reality, right? It's not just him anymore, right? He has wives, he has kids, they're about to meet up with Esav. He has to go with them. The rest of the narrative is actually really interesting, by the way. I don't know if I'm allowed to give homework here, but if anybody is curious, when he actually does go and meet up with his brother Esav, it's one of the most fascinating dialogues that the Torah has, because Jacob reunites with Esav, right? He says he hugs and he kisses him. And then Esav asks him to stay with him. Jacob says, no, I actually need to go on my own journey. But Jacob says, and I'm paraphrasing here, so I might butcher the exact quote, it was really nice to see you, for your face is like the face of God. It's the only time in the entirety of the Tanakh where a human looks at another human and says, when I see your face, I see God, right? It's almost as if Jacob is recognizing, right, this idea at the beginning of Jewish tradition of all humans created in the image of God. He's actually internalized it now, right? He sees his brother, who at this point, up until now, we've seen as this terrible hunter, blood-hungry person who he has to run away from, all the way to now actually seeing him as another human, right? One interesting interpretation. Susan, go for it, and then I'll read the comments.
Actually, before you made the remark about Jacob no longer the individual, but having a family, it struck me that actually this is the point where it really, he is an individual. And what I always gloss over in reading Tanakh is that he struggled with man. So it's like the whole picture he struggled with. And I would argue or phrase it, he is an individual within the community. He's this more whole person because he has done these battles. But you're right. I mean, it is that there's a community there that he then needs to meet up with.
Yeah, no, I love that. And just to, just because it's, again, interesting, and I have the power of the internet here, and I can share my screen, and I think I have the sole power here. So I'll take advantage of my technological powers here. Right, this is the conversation, right? Vayomer Yaakov, right? Yaakov is now saying to Esav, Al na imna matzati chen be'einacha, right? Please, if you, I find favor in your eyes, v'lakacha minchati miadi, right? Please accept these gifts from me. Ki al kain ra'iti panacha, I have seen your face. Ki ra'ot panei Elohim v'tirteni, right? I see your face, and it's like seeing the face of God. Now, one thing to note, right? The place that he named this encounter with the angel is Peniel. Here he's saying again, Peni Elohim, right? Same word, right? So there's something going on here, right? This is a very rich chapter for connections here. Again, we don't have time to get into all these. Maybe I don't know, I think we'll probably read this in the weekly Torah portion in about a month or 5 weeks. So we can go more into that. Julian says, Abraham is mentioned in an ancient tablet of financial transactions. That is really interesting, Julian. I don't recall seeing that, but if you can remember the details, I would love to see that. And then Ruth says, Jacob has changed physically from the encounter, a metaphor. Yeah, exactly, right? I think that's spot on. Marilyn, were you gonna say something?
Well, that last passage where he says, where Jacob says to Esau that he's the face of God, I think forgiving is one of the very hardest things for humans to do. And because Esau was forgiving Jacob for his indiscretions from the past, he sees God in his face because of that.
Yeah, I like that, right? And what you're saying, just to almost generalize what you're saying a little bit, is this is no longer a context where if you have disagreements, you're gonna, go to war with each other and kill, right? You have room for seeing the humanity. And one of the amazing things, and again, the sort of rabbinic interpretation of Esav does not end very happily. The rabbis do not treat Esav very well in the Midrash, because Esav becomes synonymous with, the nation of Edom, Rome, which then becomes synonymous with the Christian world, right? So Esav is dragged through the mud in the rabbinic literature. But at least sticking with just the Torah to some extent, it's an incredible ending, because where Yaakov and Esav leave each other is they go their separate ways, but only after an understanding and acknowledgement of each other's humanity, right? Like they're both trying, right? If you read the story non-cynically, right? Because there is a cynical way to read the story, as the rabbis do, right? Again, rabbis in the Midrash were not too appreciative of Esav. But again, if you take the story at face value, right, as a part of the Torah instead of the way that it's depicted in the rabbinic commentary, this is an incredible story of two people, two future nations that were going to hate each other, that decided to go their separate ways after both trying to shower each other with gifts and after both realizing the humanity of the other, right? Oh, we have disagreements. We have different ways we want to live our life. You're the paradigmatic, hunter, man of the field. I'm the paradigmatic man who, as the Torah describes Jacob, the man who sits in tents and, studies books, right? As Genesis describes. Well, we actually don't need to go spending our whole life chasing after each other, killing each other, right? The world's big enough for both, right? You, Esau, can go to Mount Seir, and I, Jacob, can go to the land of Israel, and we can both establish our nations there. I think we have about 2 more minutes. So just to start concluding here, again, this class was markedly different than any of the other classes are going to be, just because, again, I wanted to lay at least some sort of the foundational roots for how we might think of ancient Jewish history, especially at the inception of our time. And again, it's so tricky in terms of, right, we spend week after week reading from the Torah portion, and there's, sort of this looming question that I feel like, it is present anytime we talk about these narratives in Genesis and Exodus, which is, what is the purpose of these stories, right? It's questions that the Talmud asks, questions that medieval thinkers ask, questions that hopefully, as we go about reading the early pages of our history from the Torah, we ask ourselves. And the answer really is memory, right? That these stories are attempting to root us in the past, but not to remain stuck in the past, right? These stories are hopefully trying to tell us something about, yes, what happened long ago, but how we want to live our life this week and tomorrow and in weeks from now, and how we want the next generation to understand these ideas and these texts. So thank you all. We're going to be every Monday, 5:30, same time on Zoom. And I'm going to be sending out some supplementary material probably tomorrow or Wednesday. So if you got the link to this, that means I have your email. And I'm also happy to hang out, but I did want to stop at 7 in case people had to go. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.